The Flames. History's greatest secret and key to a future where ships travel lifetimes to bring flames to new worlds. Those who dare to walk the fire can cross between the stars with a step if you can find a ferryman and pay your way across. For most who brave the flame alone are lost forever. May the ferryman take you. Crucible and Flame. 8. Silence and stillness filled the control station. Too much shock and pain rolled now through the small group assembled for tears or shouts. The loss of the flame was not the worst news Lieutenant Cho had for the ferryman and tender cable. The loss of the flame was devastating, to be sure. Ship 227 would see no reinforcements, no repairs, no new crew, no medicines, no emergency supplies from the worlds of man behind her, ever again. Perhaps not fatal for a fully functioning generation ship less than 30 years from its destination world and all the resources it promised. Ship 227 was not fully functional, not even close. With dull, slow words, Phil Cho recounted what had happened to his ship. His throat was thick, his voice hoarse as he fought through the news he had to share. The grav plates below the bridge had spiked, then failed. Multiple fail-safes had kept the spike from reaching even a quarter above regular gravity, but that had been enough to stress and fracture too many components, pipes, and hull sections to count. When the plates failed, the abrupt switch from artificial gravity's downward pressure to aftward pressure from 227's powerful engines had sent a shockwave through the front half of the ship. That shockwave triggered explosions, which tore 30% of the ship away. Along with a third of the physical structure, shredded and sprayed into space in their wake, went 20% of the crew, including almost all its officers, all the rich old men bargaining with legal Critchlow. 1 out of 5 of Ship 227, frozen, dead, gone. Still survivable, Phil recounted, if half her remaining crew hadn't been trapped in 7 different emergency compartments along 227's spine. They're all gonna die out there, Hernandez said. Most of them won't have suits, and there's barely enough airtime in those shelters for us to get to them all with supplies, which we don't have, let alone bring them back, strip them out of the suits we do have, and haul those suits to the next shelter. We're all gonna die then, Hamilton replied matter-of-factly. This whale needs more manpower than we've got to patch her up before something else blows, let alone keep her running for another 30 years. The ferryman giggled. He would die cold. Not burned alive, roasted, juices spitting out his throat and through his cracked, blacking skin. Cold. Even before he'd walked the fire, he'd been assured a blazing end. The line of humanity his former masters had prodded through the flame was supposed to lead to ovens, not salvation, not even for one. He guessed that was something. He giggled again, his shoulders bouncing. Pack that shit up, Cable growled, suddenly jerking to his feet. The ferryman stood right alongside him, his laughter gone, his eyes widened in shock at the trembling, raging figure beside him. The gentle tender was gone. This new man vibrated with animal fury. Hamilton, are you ready for your daughters to choke to death, are you? He poked his finger at Hamilton, then at each man in turn until they met his eyes. Hernandez, you've got a mother and uncle waiting back in the common. You ready to help su madre y su tío swallow enough pills to sleep through the end? Anger flared in their faces and all stood straighter. But it didn't last. Fuck that hopeful shit. Phil Cho laughed cruelly. It's too late. We're done. He sat down on the floor and put his head in his hands. We can't hope to get back even 1/10 of the people trapped up there. We're all dead, easy or hard, nothing to fight for, and I don't want to be around to listen when people start choking out, or watch when their eyes bug out and then go blank. So why not make it easy? The ferryman collapsed back down again. No way to save the ship, the people, the bees, he thought. with a laugh that curdled in his throat. Just like the universe, to let him go through the motions of living for going on a century, long enough so he could die inside for the people around him, before he died on the outside, too. Don't cash out yet, Phil. We can't get to them in time, no. The ferryman felt Cable's hand on his shoulder. But he can. The ferryman looked up. What, you want to abandon ship? Shuttle as many as we can reach in time back to the wreckage? He couldn't muster up emotion to color his words, to color how stupid the idea truly was. Ship's going too fast. It'd take years of food and air we don't have getting back to the flame on conventional engines, even if we could find it again. Cable leaned down, pulling the ferryman by the shoulders to face him straight on. His eyes were wild, but his face serious, pleading. We can't ever go back, I know that. But we can save as many of our people as we can reach. We don't need suits, and we don't need to make the trip out and back each time if you bring the survivors back through the flame before their air runs out. Hernandez laughed cruelly and walked away. Hamilton backed away as if the tender had become radioactive. TC, Cho gasped. Don't lose your shit, please. I goddamn cannot take any more crazy. Cable's eyes bore into the ferryman. It's not suicide. Cable barked urgently, shaking his shoulders. He let his confusion play on his face. What are you? He froze. What, you believe in Immaculate Conception, too? No. Cable shook his arms harder. I've seen it. I swear to you, I've seen it. He pushed the tender off. It's not real. It's grandiose suicide. He pointed at Cho. If I'm going out, I'm raiding the pharmacy with him, not burning myself to death. Cable reached his hands out, pleading. I swear to you, I've seen it. When I was a boy, my ferryman showed me. You asked why I was a tender, why I pick and choose what to believe in. This is why. Hernandez and Hamilton flanked Cho now, who licked his lips, his face contorted with the agony of someone deciding whether to risk greater pain by believing one more time instead of giving up. You got something, Cable? He asked dubiously, but with a flicker of hope. You're not off your rocker. You really got something? Cable ignored him, channeling all his energy through his eyes and reaching, pleading with his hands. Don't be afraid. You're afraid of the burning, yes? Well, you're done if I'm wrong anyways. So what if you burn? If you can't strike a spark, we're all going to burn, or freeze, or choke to death. But you can. You can strike a spark. You can still be a ferryman. You can still save us all. He finally nodded and stood up and joined the group on the float and walk back to the elevator and back up to the commons. He didn't believe, really. He'd heard the rumors before. He'd seen the adventurous, fictional vids. He'd even read the literature of a couple crazy offshoots of the church over the centuries. It was all shit. He'd never seen it, never heard a whisper of it from the dozens of ferrymen he'd crossed paths with. Striking a spark was something his kind laughed about. It was a made-up superpower like all the other superpowers, the real sparks. The short-lived mortal men and women who revered them dreamed up to make ferrymen even closer to gods, because one thing every living soul feared was their end. In a world of uncounted trillions, life meant nothing, and death came easy. All other religions had fallen into such small numbers as to not even really matter anymore. The most common belief in all the worlds, walking through a flame changed your soul in some way, made you purer or better or closer to godhood. That's why there were still damn fools who crossed the flame alone and did so again and again until they just didn't come out the other side. Diametrically opposed and just as close to universal was the most common fear of those the mortals revered and loved and feared. Ferrymen, almost to the last man and woman, feared burning. Immolation inside a fire that was not a flame, just a shell for energy. The elevator cage door opened and the tender hurried them all out, whispering encouragement and shouting condemnation to spur Cho and his men to move faster. The ferryman realized as he picked up his own pace that this was how he would die. Because he couldn't say no to this old man. Couldn't die in a more comfortable way if it meant Cable's body would eventually still and cool, believing the ferryman had betrayed his flock. He whimpered. This had been his destination from the start. From the first time he walked through the flame, in shit and piss-encrusted prisoner's clothes, before he had felt the furious power in his first crossing and risked sure death from the soldiers' rifles to race back through the flame laughing, and then raced back again to enjoy the shock and dismay of those who believed themselves so much better than he. He'd do it. He had been given centuries of majestic riches and power and youth. It had not changed him. If the gesture cost him the life that had been empty before Cable, he'd do it. Somehow his fleeting moment here, with Cable and his flock, had changed him. The fish in the water, the bees in the hive, the warm fresh bread and the honey in his mouth had changed him. He laughed. Yes, every moment and thought, washed down with much, impossibly had changed him. And so he walked numbly but willingly behind the men of Ship 227. He returned to the common, to the square before the church, and stood where he was told. He watched as the tender, Cho, and both of his men carried an old stone brazier each from within the sanctuary. He waited there, mute with his own terror and commitment, as the men shattered one long wooden pew after another. He willingly assisted in what he knew would be his prophesied agonizing end, blackened by fire. The ferryman himself fed the wood brought to him from the pews into the leaping, crackling bonfire. He stood, shivering, even in the heat raging from between the 4 metal braziers that had been knocked over onto the wide square stone. He deserved this, and no better. What had he done with near immortality, with endless riches? Had he attempted to influence power and stay violence? No. He had walked through the flames as cowed by his own avarice, as he once had been by chains and the stiff, fetid cloth of his prison clothes. The people of 227 deserved better. Cho and his men, and most of all tender Cable, deserved better. They deserved something he could not give them. That was worth dying for, even if the chance was only a crazy seed in an old man's mind. So he waited until the last cracked piece of wood was sacrificed to the bonfire. He waited until the whispers of the flock who had emerged from their shelters, trusting their tender when he promised the ferryman would save them, grew into cries and prayers that rivaled the roar of the licking flames. He waited until Cho gave him a long cylindrical tube, opened at one end with cotton and dried grasses and feverishly shaved chips of wood stuffed inside. He waited until he realized the flock had been silenced, and only then did he look out at them. Old and young, white-faced with fear and flush with faith, kneeling, standing, reaching, arms raised to what the gravity plates tricked them to think of as the sky in eager supplication. Then Cable was in front of him, eyes bright, cheeks wet. "You can do this." The ferryman nodded. "I will." He moved, then stopped himself. "Thank you, Cable. He realized his cheeks were now wet too. "Thank you." He moved around Cable, hefting the open vacuum-rated supply capsule in his hand. "Foster." The ferryman turned, looking his question back. The tender admitted something in the word, something that shamed him, but also unburdened him in the saying. "The name I gave the church? It was Foster. It's yours, if you want it." The ferryman swallowed hard. "Foster," he gasped, accepting the gift. Cable nodded and walked around the flames. "I'll be there to shake your hand on the other side." then disappeared behind the hungry reaching fire and white smoke. The ferryman, my name is Foster, walked into the flame. Walk the Fire by John Miro. Learn more at servingworlds.com. Theme music, Full On by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. Many of the stories you listen to here on Serving Worlds were made possible by the support of patrons at patreon.com/servingworlds. If you got $1 of entertainment from this story, please consider backing me for $1 at patreon.com/servingworlds. Thank you for listening.